Excited for Thanksgiving? Heck yes, I'm excited for Thanksgiving. How about you? I bet you're excited. Heck yeah! Oh yeah, dude, I'm excited. I'm excited. I like this time of year. I don't like it when fall starts, you know, and it starts to get colder and less sunny. But once we get towards Thanksgiving and Christmas, I'm like, I'm on board. So, heck yeah, I'm excited for Thanksgiving. Man, in the semester, it's getting towards the end. Because after this break, 2 weeks of class, right? It's the home stretch. You guys are close to the finish line. 1 or 2 more homeworks. We're gonna have just 2. We have 2. We have 2. Because I'm gonna do... Yep. 2 homeworks. And then we have our exam. Our second exam. I forget which day it is. Maybe it's like Wednesday the 16th or something. Something like that. The exam is cumulative, right? Dilly, I think you are correct. But it'll emphasize the more recent stuff. Same format, you know, it'll be open notes and so on. Yes, sirree. Getting close to the end. And then you guys know that the spring semester is starting like a week later, right? Because, well, it's a two-edged sword because we lost our spring break. RIP spring break, but 1 week longer winter break. Not a fan of winter break being 2 months. Wait, is it 2 months? All the homies live elsewhere. Oh, man. Wait. Because it's going to be... Like, I guess Friday the 18th is like, it would be the end of the end. Oh my goodness. Because what are we gonna start? February 8th or something? Oh, since you're leaving Buffalo tomorrow, it is gonna feel like 2 months. Oh man. Yeah, you're right. Where are you heading? Still in New York, right? Long Island, gotcha. Hey, but you have your Long Island homies. They have homies as well. I'm not one of the... Hey, I have no problem with Long Island. I've never been there, but I have no problem with Long Island. Man, you're not going to believe it, but I haven't been to the city. I've been in Buffalo like 9 years now, but I've never been to the city. I don't know what I'm doing. Grew up there, great location, mostly annoying people. That's funny. I do love being close to New York City, though. That's fun. Yeah. Yeah, I want to go to the city. I mean, not right now. But I want to go really badly. Are you guys ready to talk about aircraft control systems? We're getting into the fun stuff. I love the control systems. It's where we get to take dynamics and really apply it. So I love control systems. If you want to take a control systems course in the spring, well, I mean, you guys are aerospace. You don't have as much room in your technical elective schedule. I know it's very aerospace majors is very packed already. But if you have space, you can take digital controls. I'll be teaching that in the spring. It'll be a good time. But today we're gonna get into some controls basics. So I want to start this example, and we're not going to finish it today. We're going to resume it after Thanksgiving, and yeah, I think it'll take one more class period to finish this example. But as we go through this, I'm going to introduce you to some controls terminology. I mean, we have a short amount of time in this class to really dive into controls, but I think with some of these examples, you're going to be able to get the basic idea. You'll get the essence of it. That's my goal, to give you some examples that give you a good taste of what designing a control system is all about. So let's get into it. We have some transfer functions for the short period mode that we got last Wednesday. So we have a second order model for the short period mode. The short period mode is where like the nose is pitching up and down. It damps out very quickly. Like even for a Boeing, this mode only lasts 10 seconds when you excite it until it settles out and whatever. But it's kind of this annoying mode. The nose pitches up and down. And so anyways, using that model for the short period, you can make some transfer functions that relate. Number one, this relates the angle of attack to the elevator angle. So if you perturb that elevator on the tail of the aircraft, it'll introduce some oscillations in the angle of attack. That's what this transfer function is all about. And there's a second transfer function we get from that model. So Q is the pitch rate. So that's just the rate at which our pitch angle changes. And so we have a transfer function for that one as well. If you deflect the elevator, it'll introduce some oscillations in your pitch rate. Okay, so we are going to use these transfer functions for the controller that we're going to design. So these will be like the backbone, the model for our aircraft. Okay, so we're going to use these to design an altitude control system. So what is an altitude hold control system? And just from the name, you probably already have a good idea. Okay, so as the name implies, an altitude hold control system maintains the altitude of an aircraft. Despite perturbations from external forces. All right, so it's like, all right, we want to cruise at 40,000 feet, and then we lock in the altitude hold control system. So, I don't know, if there's any perturbation, external force, an unexpected gust of wind, this control system is going to automatically bat those perturbations away and maintain the altitude. Or if you just adjusted the stick and moved the altitude, this control system would move it right back to the set point. Okay, so we're going to make a transfer function for this. So I'll show you what I mean. If we're doing level non-turning flight at constant velocity, so just imagine you're flying straight up in the sky. Earlier on in the course when we talked about reference flight conditions, we derived this first order expression for perturbations in altitude. Here it is. So delta H dot. So this is perturbations from some reference altitude, 40,000 feet, 20,000 feet, sea level, whatever. But this is going to be equal to your nominal speed, V star, times the sine of changes in your pitch angle minus perturbations in your angle of attack. And this model is assuming that the nominal pitch angle and nominal angle of attack, that those are set equal to 0 radians apiece. So here's a little schematic here. We have the aircraft. It has some non-zero pitch angle, so that's just the angle between the longitudinal body axis of the aircraft and this horizontal fixed frame axis. And then the angle of attack in here, that's just the angle between the velocity vector in the longitudinal, well, projected onto the BX, BZ plane and the nose of the aircraft. Okay, so those are those angles, and this figure is from the Nelson textbook, but when these angles are really small, so the velocity vector projected onto the BX axis, maybe I'll do that a different color. We know that that is U star. That's the projection of the inertial velocity onto that longitudinal axis. So for small angles, V is basically equal to U. So we're just going to say that V equals U. Okay, now this altitude hold control system, we're going to try to achieve this purely with the elevator. So we're just going to try to automatically have the elevator adjust so that altitude is maintained. All right. Okay. So that's what I'm saying in this sentence here. So in this case, we're going to need a transfer function where the altitude perturbation is the output of the transfer function, and the elevator angle is the input to the transfer function. All right, so I'm going to define this transfer function here. So I'm going to use like some notation for transfer functions. When I use capital G, that's going to represent a transfer function. And then I'm going to try this. I haven't done this before, but I kind of like it. I'm going to have a superscript that represents the output and a subscript that represents the input. So our transfer function, a function of S, this is going to have as the output our perturbation in altitude divided by a perturbation in the elevator deflection. So if you remember, a transfer function is the ratio of your output to your input in the Laplace domain. So that's why these are functions of S. That's the independent variable of the Laplace domain. Okay. So up above, we have a differential equation for the altitude as a function of time. Let's get it as a function of S to get this transfer function. All right. So, all right, here's our differential equation for the altitude. First, I'm going to apply the small angle approximation, meaning the sine of a small angle in radians is equal to the angle itself. And maybe we should put like an approximate equals here. But this approximate is very good up to like 10, 15, even like 20 degrees. Replacing a sine just with the angles themselves, it does a very good job. So we're assuming this difference between the angles is a small number. Now, we're going to go into the Laplace domain. So we have to take the Laplace transform of this differential equation. So we got the left-hand side, and we take a Laplace also of the right-hand side. So whenever you take the Laplace transform of a derivative here, you have to multiply by S. And we're assuming the initial conditions are 0. That's the definition of a transfer function. So you won't see any initial condition terms that usually come up when you take the Laplace transform of a derivative. Okay, now we're going on to the right-hand side. All right. And then let's divide both sides by S just to get delta H by itself. Okay. So now this is our perturbation in height in the Laplace domain. But we want the transfer function that relates this height to the elevator angle. So to do that, we're going to divide by the elevator angle in the Laplace domain. And that's going to give us our desired transfer function. So check this out. That's going to be, I'm going to bring this delta E inside. Voila. So actually we see this transfer function that we wanted relating the altitude to the elevator angle. It's a function of two other transfer functions. How the pitch angle changes with the elevator angle and how the angle of attack changes with the elevator angle. Now this brings me back to the very beginning where we introduced our short period transfer functions. So from our short period approximation, we already have the transfer function for the angle of attack related to the elevator angle, right? That's all the way up here. Boom. It's this second order transfer function, and we have it. Now, what about the other transfer function that's in here? We have this one, but what about this? Well, it turns out we also have that transfer function, believe it or not, because for non-turning longitudinal flight, just going straight, we have this relationship where this angular rate about the body y-axis, that's equal to the time derivative of the pitch angle. So this relationship isn't always true. It's just for this special case where you're flying straight, you're not turning, but you accommodate some pitching. So if we take the Laplace transform of this, we have Q of S and then S times delta theta of S. So I have the S out in front because I'm taking the Laplace transform of a time derivative. So if I just isolate delta theta of S, I have to divide this delta Q of S by S. Okay, now if I divide this by the elevator angle, oh wait, I should have this delta here. Okay, so this is that transfer function we need. It turns out it's 1 over S times this transfer function. And we have this one from our short period approximation. Okay. And then I'm just writing that out here. So then our altitude transfer function, made up of these two other transfer functions, it looks like this. It's our aircraft speed divided by S times 1 over S delta Q of S over our elevator angle all right. So we have this transfer function totally defined because we have both of these up above. Now, I don't want to get into this too much, but our aircraft equation of motion, the longitudinal equation of motion, we call it. It has 4 states. It's a 4th order model. And then we broke it into 2 second order models. Like we have the short period model, which we're using here. And we also have the phugoid or long period model, which I haven't used here. Now, the altitude of an aircraft, it actually depends on all 4 longitudinal states. But really, I'm only using the short period model to model the altitude of the aircraft. So, it seems like this is a common thing to do, to use like a simplified model, design a control system around that, and then apply it to a more complex system. So, there's some things that I'm still sorting out related to that, but we're going to proceed in this fashion, assuming that the altitude is designed around the short period model. And then I want to apply our control system to the full model once we're finished. And we might see some performance degradation. In fact, I'm expecting it. Okay, so we have this transfer function. Now, I want to get another transfer function as well. And this is for the elevator actuator. Because when you deflect the elevator, that's usually done by some kind of servo mechanism. Whether it's a ball screw or I don't know, but it's going to be driven by a motor or some hydraulic system. We're going to assume that the elevator is controlled by some kind of servo motor. So what's a servo motor? A servo motor, well, number one, it's a motor that achieves angular position control via feedback from a rotary encoder. So it's a motor that is used for position control. Like I want to, and it makes, this is a perfect application. I want to drive the elevator to some fixed angle. So a servo motor achieves that by using some feedback. It has a rotary encoder to measure the angular deflection, and then it can go to a specific orientation. Now, the dynamics of this servo actuated elevator can be approximated with a first order transfer function. So all this transfer function means, well, let's write it out. So the output of this transfer function is going to be the deflection of the elevator. The input is going to be a control voltage all right, so we supply a voltage to the servo motor, and that voltage corresponds to some deflection of the elevator. Okay, so we got the output divided by the voltage, and this is often a first order relationship. Now, the way a first order system works, you guys know this. That means over time, if I provide like a step voltage input, let's say I want my elevator to deflect 2 degrees or something. It's going to not immediately go there. Nothing in life works that way. Rather, it'll gradually go up there, kind of in this exponential fashion. And the speed at which it gets there, it can be quantified with the time constant of the servo motor. All right, and then there's this proportionality constant. Don't worry too much about that. The main takeaway here is that if you're on an aircraft, we're working to achieve altitude control, to just hold our altitude. We're going to do that using an elevator, but there's some lag in how the elevator moves, just because it takes time to power up the servo motor and deflect the elevator. So, okay, how fast is this? So a typical time constant is between a 20th of a second and a quarter of a second. And remember, the settling time is defined as 4 times the time constant. Now, the settling time is, I would think of that as how long it takes for the elevator to actually get to where I want it to be. So that means we're looking at, it takes a quarter of a second up anywhere up to like a full second. All right. So we're going to model that realistic little bit of lag in there. Okay, so we have a couple transfer functions already. I think it's time to start introducing the feedback control loop, talking about some of these basics. I think many of you probably haven't seen feedback control formally. So we'll go through it. So, okay, a basic feedback control loop for the altitude control system is as follows. This isn't the only feedback control loop you could use, but this is probably the most basic. So I'm going to start filling this in little by little. This is called a block diagram for obvious reasons. And each of these blocks, usually you place a transfer function in there. So let's start over on the right-hand side. Okay, so the net result coming out, the output is going to be delta H, a change in altitude. All right. Now, the dynamics that produce this change in altitude, that comes from this transfer function that we derived at the beginning. It takes as an input the elevator angle, and it outputs our change in altitude. So the input to this transfer function is our perturbation in the elevator angle. So you change the elevator, it changes the altitude. Okay, now this brings us to the second transfer function, because this elevator angle, well, how does it get there? Well, we provide a control voltage to the servo motor, and then by means of a transfer function, we get an elevator angle response. So this transfer function models that time delay of like a quarter second up to a second of that elevator getting to where we want it to be. Okay, now this brings us to this final block, which we haven't played around with yet, but this is our controller. Wait, okay, so let's label these. This one represents the aircraft dynamics. This one represents the elevator servo motor mechanism. This one is our controller. So what does a controller do? Actually, let's come back to that. Let's come back to that. I want to come back over here to the right. So this loop, this is our feedback loop. What it represents is a measurement of the aircraft dynamics, which we feed back to process with our controller. So this, what's traveling along here is the measured signal of delta H, our perturbation in altitude. We're going to measure it and then feed it back. So it comes back over here, and I believe the technical name of this thing is a comparator. But what it does, we're going to have some reference or some desired change in altitude. I'll call it like delta H ref. So what comes in here is delta H, like what we actually measured. And we compare it to a reference signal. The reference signal represents the desired dynamics. Like, this is what I want to achieve. So actually, for an altitude hold control system, I desire to have no perturbation in altitude. So that would actually equal 0 for altitude hold. Okay, so what comes out of this comparator? Well, an error signal, which we'll just call lowercase e. And what is e? E is the difference between your reference signal and your measured signal. Now this brings us to the controller, because the controller is just a transfer function, and it takes in the error, the difference between the desired behavior and the actual behavior, and then it outputs a control signal, which is the control voltage for our servo. And it chooses the voltage in such a way to correct the error, to make the error go to 0 so that we approach the desired behavior. So let's put this transfer function in here. The input, the input is the error. The output is the control voltage. So error signal, control voltage, elevator deflection, so that's not too complex, right? You adjust the elevator, that changes the altitude. I measure the change in the altitude. I compare that change to a desired change, which is actually, the desired change is no change. I'm going to get a difference. I feed that difference to the controller. That provides a voltage to my elevator, servo, whatever. And then we actually change the elevator, and that adjusts the altitude again. And it just keeps going over and over and over. Okay, so the basic goal of a feedback controller. The goal is to make the aircraft dynamics approach some desired dynamics. That's all a controller does in any context, not just aircraft, but anything. A controller makes something behave the way you want it to behave. So we quantify the difference between the desired dynamics and the actual dynamics with an error signal. We just called it lowercase e, right? And in the case of altitude control, the error is the difference between the desired or reference altitude and the actual altitude. So the E, actually, I should have said altitude perturbation, because this is a linearized model about some fixed altitude already. So we have the desired altitude perturbation, and then we have the measured, like the actual. So in the case of altitude hold, like I said earlier, the desired altitude perturbation is 0. I want it to stay fixed where I left it. 0. So the error signal, it's actually pretty simple. It's just minus delta H. Okay. So the controller takes the error signal as an input, whatever that perturbation is in height is, and then it outputs an appropriate control voltage to the elevator servo. So a controller is simply a transfer function, and it's usually implemented digitally on a computer that processes error measurements and then outputs corrective control commands. But yeah, there's nothing magical about a controller. It's just a transfer function. So I say this because people sometimes are like, what is a controller? They think it's like some like complex AI or something. But as we get more into this example, you'll see in most cases, a controller is just a transfer function that we design, and it has an input and an output, and however the dynamics of that transfer function are, that's how the controller behaves. So there's no magic to it. Okay, so we're gonna let's introduce some controller terminology as we get into this altitude hold thing. The first thing we're going to define is the open loop transfer function. So this is going to be important for telling us if our controller will eventually drive the error to 0. Meaning if we get hit with a gust of wind and our altitude increases, is our controller going to bring us back to our original altitude? Well, the open loop transfer function will tell us that eventually. So what is it? It's a transfer function. So what a transfer function has an input and an output. It's going to have href as an input. Actually, yeah, that's fine. That's fine. And delta H as an output. But as the name implies, open loop, we're going to assume that the feedback loop is severed. So we cut it. The measurement doesn't come back in here anymore. So we could just assume that there's just a 0 coming into this channel. Just assume the feedback is 0. All right. So the way we're going to develop this transfer function is we're just going to kind of work backwards from the right. So delta H of S is going to be equal to this transfer function, our aircraft altitude dynamics transfer function, times our elevator angle perturbation, right? So that's just using this little block right here. But then our elevator angle, where does that come from? Well, that comes from the control voltage going through this elevator servo transfer function. So we're going to just like keep working backwards here. So I'm going to keep this transfer function here, but now for my elevator angle, I'm going to use this other transfer function that takes an input as the control voltage. Its output is the elevator angle. So now I'm multiplying by that control voltage. Okay, and now we're going to just go back, peel back another layer like an onion. Because where does the control voltage come from? Well, the controller decides what the control voltage is based on the error signal. So let's just put everything in here. So you have this cascade of transfer functions, just one feeding into the next. So this takes the error signal as an input and it outputs the control voltage. And so now I have this at the end. Oh, buddy. And for open loop, this is equal to our reference signal. I'll show you on the diagram in a second. Zoom out a little bit here. Because you see, here's our error signal over here. Well, what does the error signal come from? Well, it's the difference between our reference signal and the feedback signal, but we cut that feedback signal for the open loop. So it's just 0 coming in here. There's nothing coming in. So that means it's basically the error is the same as that. So I could also put that variable in here. Anyways, this right here is the open loop transfer function for our altitude control system. And when you're doing control systems, the open loop transfer function keeps popping up over and over again. Chin says, I'm here to review some road vehicle dynamics and say hi. Hi, Chin. Glad to have you here. Chin's in our road vehicle dynamics class. Okay. So we'll come back to this transfer function. But now I want to look at the closed loop error transfer function. This is a cool transfer function. This is the transfer function with the error signal as the output and the reference signal as the input. And as opposed to the open loop transfer function, we're going to assume that the feedback loop is closed. All right, let's just get into this transfer function, and then I'll tell you why I think it's so cool. Okay, so we're gonna build this the same way. So what is the error? It's the difference between my reference signal, this reference altitude, and my measured altitude. So I'll replace this here. Here, for delta H, I'm going to use our open loop transfer function. That actually, we get to recycle it here. Excuse me. Because delta H, as we have up here, is related to our error function via the open loop transfer function. Let's put it in here. So H, so I'm going to put these three transfer functions cascading together. This is our open loop transfer function. Times our error signal. So let's point this out again. Our open loop transfer function shows up. You know what though? Because this takes a lot to write each time, how about we make a definition? We're going to call it G open loop. It's going to make us all happier. Okay. So look, we got this error term on the right and this error term on the left. Let's gather all the error terms together on the left. Okay, so we're going to have 1 plus our open loop transfer function times E is going to be equal to our, the only thing left on the right hand side, that reference signal. So now I'm going to get this error transfer function. Maybe I'll call it G. The input is our reference signal. The output is the error. So E of S over H ref of S. That's going to be 1 over 1 plus G open loop. Okay, so why do I think this transfer function is very interesting and important? This tells us for any reference signal, this gives us the dynamics of the error between our desired and our actual dynamics over time. So, like, let's make a little graph here. So let's say this is time, and I'm going to make up something here. Let's say this is my desired altitude over time. So we're ascending. We're climbing up to some other altitude, right? So the way a controller works is like right when you introduce a change in your reference, the controller has to kind of catch up, and it gets closer and closer to the reference over time, hopefully. And we'll go over different types of steady state error, but ideally you would eventually catch up and align with this reference, right? So the error is the difference between these over time. So this transfer function that we just derived, if we do this error over time, let's see, like looking at this picture above, what is the y-axis on that graph? Oh, I'm plotting perturbations in altitude, I guess. So the pink is the reference, and then the dark one is the actual. And then the error is the difference between. So if you plot this difference over time, that's what our transfer function is about. Like the error, it looks like it started at 0 and then it grew and then it like exponentially decayed back down to 0. This transfer function is going to tell you all about these dynamics. And in fact, when you design a controller, the way controller design works is you, in advance, you pick what you want these aerodynamics to be, and then you design a controller such that that happens. Okay. So the closed loop characteristic equation, excuse me. So, okay, what can sometimes happen, right, is you design a controller and maybe it just goes crazy. It doesn't go towards your reference at all. That can happen if we're not careful when we design a controller. So what's going to tell you that is the stability of this transfer function. If this closed loop aerodynamics transfer function is unstable, you're never going to approach the reference signal. You're going to diverge to infinity. So how do I know if it's stable or not? Well, you look at the characteristic equation and you look at the roots of the characteristic equation. Now for a transfer function, the characteristic equation is the denominator. The closed loop characteristic equation is the denominator of this transfer function when we set it equal to 0. So we have 1 plus g open loop of s equals 0. That's our characteristic equation. And we have to make sure that this is stable, number one, when we design our controller. So the roots determine the system's stability and the transient characteristics like settling time, if there's going to be oscillations in the response. So yeah, first and foremost, you have to design a controller that's stable. All right, so I'm gonna make one more point and then we'll stop here. And then you're gonna have a fantastic Thanksgiving. All right. Okay, so let's say given that you design something that's stable, you should also guarantee that the steady state error is 0. I mean, that would be ideal for an arbitrary step reference condition. So what I mean in this case is, if I'm going to a specified altitude, is the control system going to bring me exactly to that altitude, or is it going to overshoot it? Is it going to undershoot? And we're going to use the final value theorem to do that. So you want the limit as time goes to infinity of the error to be 0. And that is equal to the limit as s approaches 0, s times e of s. So this is the final value theorem, or rather, the 0 isn't the final value theorem, but the limit as time goes to infinity, that, here we go. And you know what? We're just going to leave it here. But next time, we're going to get into more specifics. So we'll bring back our transfer functions from the beginning. We'll put in some actual numbers. And it'll be a little less just theory. And it'll be more applied to this specific altitude hold problem. So when we come back after Thanksgiving, when you're loaded up on turkey, we're going to revisit this. But that's it for this week. We won't be meeting on Wednesday. No, sir. No, sirree. That's it for this week. That's your quick and dirty introduction to feedback controls. Yeah, have a good break, everybody. Thank you, UBMAE student. I second that motion. I second that. Hey, enjoy the break, Dilly. Srechtenwald, happy Thanksgiving to you. Happy Thanksgiving. There's a lot to be thankful for. Hey, Phil. Stay safe. All right, everybody. I'm going to sign out. Happy Thanksgiving again.